Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
It is illegal to bring bears to the beach in Israel. Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Captain Caleb. Today we have a bevy of stories. We're going to start off with a few stories about disputes, including a man who sawed his neighbor's garage in half amid a boundary dispute. Then we're going to transition into some animal stories, starting off with a dad fighting a shark in order to save his son. And then after that, we're going to move into some spooky stories, including a man who dressed up as a ghost in a Portsmouth cemetery. And we also have a Satanic Temple that offers academic scholarships to high school graduates, which is just excellent. They didn't have that when I was a kid. Satanic Temples never looked out for me. Alright, and then we're going to conclude with my top 10 military blunders, which is one I've been excited to do for a heck of a long time. So military blunders, that'll include snafus, mistakes, so it'll be kind of funny, but also kind of tragic at the same time. But isn't that why you're here? To listen to things that are both funny and tragic? Okay. A man in Maine saws his neighbor's garage in half amid a boundary dispute. So this one comes from way back on July 18th, 2020. But I got this idea, right? My idea was that I would have some listeners of the show, they'd send in their own stories that they wanted to hear about, along with some jokes and funny observations. So I put out this notice that I'm looking for people to give me their own stories and their jokes along with the stories. And I get a response from the one person who's left me comments. There's only one person who's left me comments on my podcasts over the month I've been doing them. And so this story comes to us from one Robby Canton. Alright, so back to this story about the neighbor's garage being sawed in half. So this all started back in 2016. This actually started before that. So this all started back when these two neighbors had a great relationship, and one day, one neighbor said to the other, "Hey, I think I could use a little extra land. Could I build a giant garage that goes about 7 feet onto your land?" And the Bronze said, "Yes, that would be absolutely okay with us." So the Bronze are the people who would later saw the garage in half. Now, how did they get to that conclusion? In 2016, their nice neighbor dies, and his wife takes over the estate. So now she owns the garage that's 7 feet into her neighbor's property, the Bronze's property. And she is quoted saying, "When the dad, her husband, was still alive, this was a perfect place to live. As soon as that poor man passed away, this place turned into craziness and chaos." Now, this chaos started when the Bronze put a load of wood chips right next to the shed, right next to the garage where it overlapped on their lot boundary. Later that same day, the owner of the garage came by and planted a stake in the ground where the chips had been placed. He said, quote, "This is our property, get your stuff off it." And later that week, the two called in a surveyor in order to determine where the land is technically split. And they determined that the line between the properties cut right through the middle of the garage. So Braun, the owner of that extra property, said that, quote, The day the surveyor came and set pins, the tenants that were there packed up and moved out that night. So they were not too happy about it. As a catharsis, Braun tried to negotiate with the family in order to buy their entire property. That way the dispute would end as quickly as possible. But that family said no. So they technically also don't own the half of the garage that is on their neighbor's property. And so later that week, the young man we talked about earlier who planted a stake in the wood chips, a vital act of revolution, he came back and asked if he could gather his father's ashes from the garage. The garage that would later be cut in half. And the Brauns said, quote, "Please do. We want our property back because we've been paying taxes on it for years." But then he, the young man collecting his father's ashes, went over there and started throwing trash all over the place and smashing glass and taking bureaus and throwing them outside in the yard. So obviously this dispute escalated as a result of this child getting his father's ashes and also trashing the place in order just to spite his neighbors, most likely. But Gabriel Braun, he works in construction. So what he did is he took a big old handsaw, an electric handsaw, and skillfully cut down the half of the garage that was on his family's property. And he left the remains on the other side of the surveyor's line so that the other family could have what was rightfully theirs. So he just cut it in half with a handsaw. That's pretty skillful. And as a result, as you can imagine, the family with half a garage, they moved out pretty quickly. They're still trying to sell the property, but it's hard to advertise a house with half a garage. They called the police, but the police said, quote, "We were aware of the situation and believe it has been resolved at this point." So they're siding with the man who sawed the garage in half. And speaking of the guy who sawed the garage in half, he said, quote, "We're putting up a fence. Fences make good neighbors. That's what we've learned from this." That's excellent. So there is a silver lining in this story, people. Build a fence, not sheds, across your boundary line. All right, so that story came from us, as I said earlier, from Robby Canton. I'd like to thank him. And he also had a few jokes he wanted me to read about this story. I'm going to start with this one. Who keeps their father's ashes in their garage? Is there no fireplace mantle where these guys are from? Was their father that much of an alcoholic? Oh, come on, Robby. That's a bit presumptuous. So he also says the mom would say to the dad, "Fine, we can keep his ashes, but they're not coming in the house. Leave them in the garage." So that's Robby's joke. Good joke, Robby. Thanks for participating in my little experiment. We'll see how long it lasts. All right, our next story. So this one does not come to you from Robby Canton. This is about female doctors that are fighting the man by posting bikini pictures. The perfect story. So basically what happened was they're fighting against this journal, this medical journal. So this journal deemed that photos that display alcohol or, quote, contain inappropriate attire, such as bathing suits or costumes, are potentially unprofessional content. And as a response, a bunch of female surgeons and doctors and healthcare workers have been posting pictures of themselves in bikinis. #MedBikini. So you can go online and look at all these pictures. Some of them are quite fantastic. But at the end of the day, the result of all this is that the report was actually retracted. So they won their fight. They won their fight against sexism. Great for them. This is a nice, short, little uplifting story. Alright, time for our last story of this segment, which is going to bridge between our fighting segment and our animal segment. This is emus banned from Outback Queensland pub after bad behavior. So, Queensland is an Australian state, for those who didn't know. And the article says it's a pub, but it's actually a Yaraka hotel in the remote southwest Queensland, Australia, and it ended up having to barricade its entrances in order to keep the birds out. Now, these emus were celebrities before this story hit. They were hatched and raised in this small town and kind of become a tourist highlight. They're the ugliest looking birds, but apparently they're highlights in Australia. I think they have much cooler animals than emus. Anyways, the hotel owner said, quote, "They recently learned to climb front steps and have been causing havoc. We don't really want them becoming patrons in the hotel," he said. "Because when they do get in here, they behave a bit badly." And so, in order to deter the emus, he left a sign saying, quote, "Emus have been banned from this establishment for bad behavior. Please let yourself in through the emu barrier and then reconnect, please." So they put up a sign in order to keep the emus out. Forgetting, of course, that emus cannot read. I guess that's what the barriers are for, though, isn't it? To be fair. But this article also notes that the emus are known to target tourists, stealing their food, drinks, car keys, and generally making a mess. Quote, "Their toileting inside is not particularly pleasant. That's the biggest problem, because they do toilet quite frequently." Now, they actually blame this problem on the tourists, saying that tourists have been incentivizing these birds to behave badly by hand-feeding them and jingling shiny things in front of the birds to get their attention. So note to self, people, if you ever travel if you ever travel to Australia, don't feed the emus. Come on, people. But apparently these new gates they put up are working. Quote, "They still hang around outside of each gate, hoping that they'll be able to slip in when someone opens it up. But so far, we are winning the war." So that's another happy story about winning the war. First, we've defeated sexism this week by posting bikini pics. And now we've defeated the emus. Good job, world. We're bouncing back quickly in 2020. 2020's been hard, but we are bouncing back. Now, a quick emu PSA here. Don't screw with the emus. People have actually been killed by emus. Basically what they are, they're giant birds. And even a very friendly emu can be known to get aggressive during breeding season. They're really gross. I don't know why you'd want to touch them in the first place. They look like dinosaurs with fur. Anyways, that's it for this segment all about fighting. Stay tuned for the next segment where we'll go over some animal stories, including a man who jumps in the water and fights away a shark in order to protect his child. So stay tuned for that and a few more animal stories. I'll give you my Florida story of the week. So stay tuned. Don't want to miss out on that.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. Oh, I'm supposed to do a little fact. The Cookie Monster's real name is Sid. Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're going to get into some animal stories now. Stay tuned and I'll give you some of my favorite military blunders, failures, and all-around bad times. Gonna get historical on you guys. Okay, but for now we're going to do some animal stories. Starting off with my Florida story of the week. Florida police are perplexed after finding a kangaroo roaming the streets. Quote, "We don't really believe it." Now, I think this is funny coming from a place that is used to seeing, crocodiles, giant pythons, really anything that's perfectly designed to kill a human. But when it comes to kangaroos, they're absolutely surprised. Now, the police were actually the first to come across this kangaroo because it was at Fort Lauderdale, where the police patrol nonstop. And they said, quote, "At first we didn't really believe it because there was only one call. So when we got there, sure enough, there was a kangaroo." Not really much of a quote. But I think it well states the mindset they had going into this call. This is why they joined the force in the first place, is because in Florida you get all these bizarre calls like this one. And you can actually go online and watch the video of them taking him into custody, this kangaroo into custody. They actually have about 8 police cars and just as many men in order to take down this ferocious beast. But they say it was a rather non-violent confrontation. They basically just walked up to it with a dog leash. I'm sure the most confused individual in this scenario is the kangaroo. He's wondering how he got to Florida. Took a wrong turn around the islands of the Pacific. I don't know. So he went pretty easily into custody. When asked about the takedown, one of the police officers said, quote, "We just tried to corral it and keep it out of traffic. We tried to make a plan, and then we were able to come together and get him kind of surrounded. Once we had him, we kind of closed in. He's very friendly. We were able to get a rope around his neck and get him back to the car. He didn't resist. I was actually expecting to get kicked, but he was very friendly and didn't do anything." Now, it's important to note that due to the specific circumstances of being a police force in Florida, the Fort Lauderdale police actually have their own barn. So they just took the kangaroo to their barn and locked him up. They went on to say, quote, "Fort Lauderdale code does not allow exotic animals like this within the city limits. And as a result, they have yet to find who the animal belongs to. Nobody's going to come forward and say, yeah, that's my exotic animal. Come lock me up instead." I mean, they might. That would also be a heroic story. But instead, it's most likely that he'll end up in the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation, which is where most exotic misplaced animals in Florida end up, according to this article. They have a whole department for exotic animals. I love Florida. Okay, now the one we're all here for. A shark grabs a 10-year-old boy from a fishing boat in Australia, but swims off after the boy's father jumps in the water to save him. This is the most heroic story of the week. I don't know, we'll get into the military stories later, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if I would jump into the water if a shark grabbed my child. That seems like a pretty determined shark, Anyway, let's reassure you early on. The boy was taken to a hospital. He was in stable conditions. He only had lacerations and cuts after the attack, so he will be fine. Now, the event occurred when the child and his father, along with 2 other men, were fishing 3 miles from the shore when a shark, quote, grabbed him from the boat. Now, Ambulance Tasmania, which is it's something in Australia. They said, quote, "The boy was wearing a professional floating device, suffered lacerations to his arm and other cuts to his chest and head, but is otherwise fine." Now, obviously, Australia has one of the world's highest incidences of shark attacks, and there have been 5 fatal maulings in the country so far this year. The most recent being only a week ago when a 15-year-old surfer was actually killed by a shark. That's no good. Anyways, back to the story. The father, it's said by professionals that what happened was the father scared away the sharks. Sharks are very spookable. So, first of all, the shark was most likely struggling with the child's flotation device, and then when the dad jumped in, it scared the fish off. One of the onlookers of the situation said, quote, "The father was doing an amazing job in the circumstances. It was pretty scary. Seeing a child in his parents' arms looking pretty ordinary, it was pretty amazing." So the father's care after the incident made the child look almost like nothing had happened. He was keeping the child calm, which is one of the most important things to do in such a circumstance. She also said, quote, "I don't think I would have done as good a job as he did in the situation." So, like father, like son, apparently this child is also extraordinarily brave, being able to, quote, "recount the ordeal and answer questions despite his injuries." Despite he just got bitten by a shark. He'll just put that at the top of his resume and he'll be able to get any job he wants. Am I saying this child is lucky? Yes, he is privileged. He has shark privilege. Now, I'm sorry, folks. Now, the child is said to be in stable condition after suffering chest, head, and arm wounds during the attack. That's where I find issue with this story, is the shark got him in the chest, head, and arm. So I guess he jumped into the boat, grabbed his chest, head, and arm, and pulled him into the water. That's pretty amazing that the child survived after suffering from those wounds. I mean, those are really two of the three things I think somebody would really not have an easy time walking away from. Experts were further consulted on the damage done to the boat by the shark that jumped onto the boat in order to snag the child. And they said that due to the damage on the side of the vessel, the predator must have been, quote, "at least 3 meters long." So that's a 10-foot tall shark. So that's probably about as tall as the ceiling of the room you're in right now. And the experts also said, "I have heard of shark attacks occurring before, but I have never heard of anyone being pulled out of a boat." And that is how this harrowing story ends. Now we're going to move into a slightly softer tale, one that's a little more heartwarming. I guess that one was pretty heartwarming. This one's even more heartwarming. You know why? Because this one has a red panda in it. Everyone's favorite fluffy striped tail bear. So, about a week ago at Columbus Zoo, which is in Columbus, Ohio, if you couldn't put that together, is they were desperately trying to find their missing red panda as he escaped from the park. Now, you look at a red panda and it doesn't look exactly like an escape artist, but I do encourage you to look up pictures of red pandas, because I could do it for hours. They're just adorable. Basically a mix of a raccoon and a bear. The ultimate predator. Anyways, they say the main problem with their search is that their facility was surrounded by dense vegetation and natural habitat for the beast, which made it difficult to find it. And as a precaution, other animals living nearby were moved so that their habitats could be searched for the bear itself. The zoo went on to explain, quote, "Footage from the den camera and security cameras located through the facility are being evaluated by staff, but so far there have been no sightings or strong evidence of how she went missing." And to make things more difficult, these are nocturnal bears, so they only come out at night and they live in the trees. So they're going to have a hard time finding this fella. They also said that this young bear is a recent mother of 2 cubs who are still nursing, which makes the care team worried. But they did mention that they are prepared to feed the cubs a specialized formula if necessary, but it will not be as good for them as being with their mother. They went on to say, quote, "The animal care team believes she is likely close and that she may return on her own due to her 2 cubs. Zoo staff are setting up an overnight watch to monitor the area." So that's how this story ended 5 days ago. And then 4 days ago, the next day, 2 guests actually spotted the bear on the ground among dense foliage between the rhino habitat and the entrance of the building in the zoo's Asia Quest region. And this is where the fun begins. It became a chase. As the team arrived on the scene, Cora climbed to a nearby tree and refused to come down on her own. Concerned about the rain clouds moving into the area, quote, the decision was made to tranquilize her. It's kind of sad, but kind of funny. She was immediately brought to the Animal Health Care Center, and the evaluation was given for a clean bill of health. Quote, Cora, that's the name of the bear. They named her after the avatar Cora. Cora has since been returned to her habitat in Asia Quest, where she will have the opportunity to reunite with her cubs when she wakes. Her care team will continue their overnight watch to ensure that they continue to do well, and Red Panda father, General Tsao, will have the opportunity to join them in the morning. So the family of bears will be reunited in their Columbian Zoo house. Not Columbian, the Columbus Zoo house in Columbus, Ohio. Beautiful. See, I told you that was a heartwarming story. All right, and we're going to wrap up with a depressing one, because that's how I like to leave you people, in a sad mood. A cat was diagnosed with coronavirus in the first UK case of animal infection. So this this has encouraged health advisors to promote the idea and warn owners not to kiss their pets or share food with them. That's a direct quote, by the way. A female Siamese cat has become the first animal in the UK to catch coronavirus. The cat is believed to have got the virus from their owner, and it was discovered as part of a coronavirus screening program for hundreds of cats at Glasgow. Of course it happened in Glasgow. Center for Virus Research. They tested hundreds of cats. You know, there are some people who might need that extra funding for coronavirus, but go ahead and test 100 cats. That's cool. It's also mentioned that the 6-year-old cat experienced only mild symptoms, including shortness of breath and nasal discharge, which I believe is just sneezing. Now, the nice lady who organizes this screening program for COVID-19 in cats said, quote, if you have any respiratory signs, be sure to catch your cough or sneeze in a disposable tissue and wash your hands before you cuddle your cat. Don't kiss your cat. Don't have the cat sleeping on the bed with you, and don't share food with the cat. Maybe I'm missing a vital part of Glasgowian culture, but that joke doesn't need a punchline. She also said, quote, I thought maybe fluffier ones would be more ready to catch any sneezes or cough droplets, but you can't draw any significance from that. So she's taking her job really seriously, as all good researchers should. It's just kind of a silly issue to research during a pandemic. So that's another thing you've learned today from this beautiful podcast. Don't share your food with your goddamn pets, folks. Not okay. You're spreading the COVID around. Okay. It's time to go to a break, but when we get back, we're going to go through some dark stories, including Satanic Temple that's offering scholarships, which is pretty cool. And stay tuned for later. I'll give you my top 10 military blunders. Stay tuned after the break, please. Please.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Allodoxophobia is the fear of opinions. Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're going to get into some dark stories right now. Stay tuned. We're going to get into my top 10 military blunders and failures later. That'll be a fun time. But for now, the first dark story. A man is fined for pretending to be a ghost in a Portsmouth cemetery. So this occurred in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where a young man, the age of 24, was spotted in the cemetery trying to scare people dressed as a ghost. He was, quote, flapping his arms, throwing himself backwards, and making ghost noises. That's in a police report. Isn't that beautiful? Now, the sad part of this is that he was reported by mourners. So people went there to mourn the death of their family, and they saw a ghost. That's kind of sad. After further investigations, the court had determined that the young man had been out drinking with his friends. And they went to the cemetery to play football. That's always my go-to place for playing football, is the cemetery. So many memories. And the policeman who arrested this young 24-year-old said, quote, "The witnesses report the group engaging in rowdy behavior and one of them throwing their arms in the air saying, 'Woo!' As punishment, the young man was fined 35 euros. I don't know why it's in euros. He was fined 35 euros in order to pay 20 extra euros of victim surcharge and another 20 in costs deterred. So he's making out with about 75 euros worth of damage. And on top of that, he had an extra 3 months added to his conditional charge for previous harassment, which he was found to be in breach of according to the prosecution. And if he does anything like this again, that's a breach in his suspended sentence. He will face 12 weeks in prison. And the funny thing is, he got in trouble for pretending to be a ghost, but he was also charged with causing criminal damage to a gravestone. So he vandalized somebody's final place of rest, but that accusation was actually dismissed because the witnesses failed to turn up at court. So these rapscallions probably won't be going back to the graveyard to play football anytime soon. But speaking of moving on, let's move on to the next one. A Satanic Temple offering academic scholarships to high school grads. Now, this Satanic Temple isn't just offering one, it's offering 2 academic scholarships. So, any students who demonstrate satanic values may apply for, quote, Devil's Advocate Scholarships Awards. The first of these is, what initiatives have you undertaken that are consistent with the Satanic Temple's tenets and mission? The second one is, please discuss and describe in detail any one of the teachers who crushed your spirit, undermined your self-confidence, and made you hate every minute you were forced to be in school. So they're really appealing to the masses here, right? I mean, that second one could be applied to about 70% of all graduating high schoolers. Why didn't you like high school? Tell the Satanic Church. They go on to say that these prompts can be answered in whatever way the high schoolers want, including essay, poems, film, art projects, and other creative mediums. And the Satanic Temple co-founder, Malcolm Jerry, he explained in his prepared statement, quote, the pursuit of knowledge and the protection of bodily autonomy constitute an essential component of the Satanic Church's mission. The compulsory school system, in opposition to our beliefs, violates students' fundamental civil rights and ingrains obedience to the unearned authority. Satanists believe in individual rights. What do you think of that? Defenders of schools often celebrate the rare teacher who is supportive. This is dishonest because inspirational teachers are anomalies. Much more common are the teachers who abusively wield their power and are outright cruel. Often these teachers leave lifelong psychological scars. Everyone has horror stories about their teachers, but this is considered unremarkable and taken for granted. The Satanic Temple wants to draw attention to this and other problems with schooling. The Satanic Temple opposition to tyrannical constructs is core and fundamental. And that concludes the brilliant statement of the Satanic Church. I think a lot is revealed in that statement, including the fact that these Satanists they really just had a bad school experience. That's why they all turned out so grumpy. I think it's funny that these satanic church-going people they're upset about teachers not being supportive. It's just all so goofy. They went on to say that a student does not need to be a member of the church in order to apply for this scholarship. Applicants will only be judged on how their submission best exemplifies the mission. So I applied for this scholarship. I was inspired by the Satanic Temple, their about page. Go to the satanictemple.com. That's where you can apply. And on their website it says, quote, "The mission of the Satanic Temple is to encourage benevolence and empathy. They also advocate for common sense. They oppose injustice and believe that they should undertake noble pursuits." Now, I recommend you go and do some research on the Satanic Temple because it's just hilarious. They're all about rights and fighting injustice. It's very funny. All these tenets are so agreeable, but then it says the Satanic Temple right above it all, so that part kind of throws you off. But, you know, if you're willing to donate, you can get a personalized membership card, so that's fun. They also sell face masks and commemorative coins. That is brilliant. So I think this is really just a goofy kind of group. I don't think this is any more different than like a Comic-Con kind of thing. Just a group of weirdos with some fun beliefs that are really not trying to do anything serious. They're just trying to have fun and spread their message while they can. But apparently you can also get a scholarship from them now. So, you know, take advantage of that, if you will. Take advantage of the Satanic Temple. You don't need to be a member in order to win the scholarship. So if you're against Satan, why not apply for the scholarship? You win the scholarship and you're taking their money, using it to promote your own values. What do you think of that? Alright, so our next story is about a floating cinema. In order to encourage social distancing, set sail in Houston. That's a little pun. It sets sail. It's really just floating on water, but basically the idea is if you feel you've been missing out by not being able to go to the movie theater during this pandemic, you can go to this water theater, and at this water theater you can rent your own little mini boat. And you can row it up and watch a movie floated onto the big screen. So basically it's the Aqua equivalent of drive-in movie theaters, which have also been popping up since the pandemic started. And now they're bringing that same kind of idea to the water. The floating cinemas will include 12 to 24 mini boats, each carrying up to 8 people. This will include a unique socially distanced entertainment experience that can't be found anywhere else, according to this company. So I think this is pretty clever because what they've done is they've basically done a drive-in movie service, but now you're renting the boats. So imagine a drive-in movie theater business where you have to pay for your car as well. You don't just pay for the ticket. So it's a pretty clever way to make money off of, the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. No, I'm kidding. They're entertaining us, folks. They're finding ways around the problems COVID has given us. Now, their excuse is that customers will be required to rent at least one mini boat, quote, to ensure that groups will be seated with friends and family only, and to allow for social distancing on and between boats. Moviegoers, therefore, will be able to watch movies in the open air, snack on free popcorn, and other refreshments available to purchase. So this is another great development in the market as a result of this pandemic, because the question is this thing going to last beyond the pandemic? I don't see it lasting during the pandemic, much less afterwards. It'll probably be popular for a week or two, but it'll quickly die out. Oh well, it was a nice try. I'd love to go try it. The company is boasting that they'll be screening a mix of new releases and classic films. The location of the theater has not been announced yet. Nevertheless, you can pre-order tickets for the Floating Cinema Experience, which starts on September 23rd in Austin, Texas. All right, now we're gonna end our news segments with a sad story about a New Zealand pond losing their beloved eel, McPherson, that's the name of the eel, during a massive storm. So this eel has been famous in New Zealand for almost 35 years. I didn't know eels lived that long. Anyway, it lived in a backyard pool and ended up disappearing in a once-in-a-500-year flood, which tore through New Zealand and took their beloved eel away from them. Now, thankfully, the place this pond was located is only about 50 meters from the beach in New Zealand, and so it's most likely that this eel did not die during the storm, but rather just ended up in the ocean. Hopefully it has its means intact to survive. The eel's owner's granddaughter said, quote, "It would have had just to go down the driveway and across the road at high tide during a flood. It wouldn't really have even needed to worry about the beach." So she speculates that it made it to the beach, which is nice. And then this young lady had a talk with her grandfather, the man who owned the fish, and said that he felt a bit gutted by it. But she sat him down and had a talk with him and said, quote, "But once we had a chat about it, we realized the timing of it would be right for it naturally to spawn." So they expect it not only to have made it to the ocean, but also to breed successfully. Apparently it's the right time in New Zealand for such an event to occur. So the reason this eel became famous in the first place is because way back in 1995, the eel was popularized because the pond it was held in was public, and many children came by and played with it, and it kind of gave away the stigma that eels were gross. Kind of made them a cute creature. It actually held some significance in that New Zealand town. And to wrap up this story, we're going to end with another quote. The young lady said, "They don't all have that characteristic where they're so tame and their demeanor is so peaceful that they don't mind people and can handle a bit of a pat. It was a very special creature and an excellent ambassador for its species. It wasn't just any eel." Please stay tuned for after the break, where I'll go over my top 10 military mishaps.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. we're going to get into my top 10 funny military mistakes. Let's just jump right in. Alright, so this first one occurred in 1943. This is during the Second World War. There were 4 ships, 3 of which were destroyers, all of which were assigned to protect the USS Iowa, which carried the current president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, during this trip, the William D. Porter ship caused a major scare when one of its depth charges accidentally fell into the water and exploded, causing the rest of the convoy to think that U-boats had found them and were attacking. So they almost killed the president, but just after the incident, the same crew, in a training exercise, inadvertently launched an armed torpedo right at the USS Iowa, the ship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt on it. But the big ship managed to dodge it, just in the nick of time. So this ship kind of has a not-so-great record, almost killing the president twice. And then later on June 10th, 1945, a kamikaze plane shot under the ship and exploded, sinking the vessel, but miraculously every single crew member survived. This kind of sounds like a cartoon, doesn't it? Alright, number 2, Hannibal caused an avalanche with his cane. This isn't number 2, this is number 9, holy crow. Okay, number 9, Hannibal caused an avalanche with his cane. So, for those who don't know Hannibal, this was during the Punic Wars way back in around 200 BC. During the Second Punic War, he was one of the most successful leaders of any nation ever to take on the Roman armies. It's actually a really interesting story if you want to look into it. But we'll get into the more interesting parts later on in this list. Parts where Hannibal proved that he was a mastermind, but for now we're going to talk about a little goof he had. So it should be noted that he was a brave man. He led elephant-wielding armies over the Alps, some of the biggest mountains in all of Europe, in order to get to Rome, because they had no ships. Rome destroyed all their ships in the First Punic War, so now they're marching through mountains, and at one point they came to an abrupt halt when the elephants refused to walk across a certain path. And angry with this holdup, the Carthaginian general, who had been marching at the rear of the entire operation, came to the front and slammed his cane into the snow-covered path to show them it was solid and safe to cross. But he was wrong. The elephants were right. The act triggered a huge avalanche and ended up killing more than half of his 50,000 men and several of his elephants. And according to the historians of the time, it took 4 days for the survivors to escape the frozen carnage and finally descend below the Alps. So a brave man willing to win at all costs, but caused a bit of a... he's directly responsible for death of half of his people. That's too bad. Alright, let's do number 8. So this one kind of goes off of number 1, where the U.S. almost accidentally sunk one of our ships. Brazilian sailors actually did shoot and sink one of their major ships by mistake. So as most military mistakes occurred, this happened during a training exercise where they were practicing shooting down planes. And the Brazilian ship accidentally hit a row of depth charges, which sank the ship in just a few minutes. They held this drill quite a ways from land, so the crew members that survived were actually out on lifeboats for almost a week before anyone came to their rescue. So that one's kind of sad. Let's move on. The British soldiers who got drunk during an invasion. So this is number, 7? So this one occurred in 1625 when the British sent a force of around 15,000 men on more than 80 ships to invade a Spanish city. Now, it goes on to note that none of these 15,000 men had been trained at all. So upon landing in the city, the soldiers were offered wine by the locals, the Spanish locals, and they became so drunk that they threatened mutiny against their own officers. And as a result of the embarrassing incident, the leaders of the expedition ordered all the men back on the ships to go back to England, but they ended up having to leave behind 2,000 men who were so drunk they weren't able to get them on the ships. Once again, alcohol playing a very important role in the historical events that make modern society. All right, number 6. Number 6 comes to us from the Japanese during World War II. They built one of the... I'm gonna do this one kind of paraphrasing. They built one of the biggest ships ever made at the time, which had a displacement of almost 65,000 metric tons once fully armed, and during this ship's departure from its initial placement on land, it actually created a 1 meter tall tsunami which flooded the surrounding area of Nagasaki. So they launched the ship, and the ship was so big that it caused a small tsunami. It's kind of funny, but also incredibly tragic as well. All right, number 5. The British accidentally invade Spain in 2002. So a few weeks ago, I talked about another incident where I think Vietnam invaded Cambodia on accident or something like that. So you can go back and listen to that if you want a similar story. But in this one, 24 British Marines on a training exercise storm a beach mistakenly thought to be Gibraltar, which is it's a little British territory right off of the shores of Spain. But instead, they came ashore on a beach resort in La Línea, which is my weekly mispronunciation of the week. And the Marines only realized their mistake after the locals and 2 policemen informed them that they were in the wrong place. Now, unlike the Cambodians in my last story, the British actually did apologize for this mistake, saying that it was an egregious error caused by bad weather. If only the military had weather apps on their phone. All right, number 4. This is kind of 2 stories I'm going to wrap into one. And it's really anybody attacking Russia, thinking that it might work out. So the most well-known ones are the French and the Germans in World War II. So the French, when they had Napoleon, they thought they'd take over Russia, but they forgot to bring sweaters, so they got cold and had to return. So out of the 500,000 troops that Napoleon had, he ended up returning with about 20,000. So it did not go well, even though they conquered Moscow. They didn't really know how to deal with without hand warmers, so that didn't go so well. And of course, there's a story where Hitler invaded Russia, and many people say it lost him the war, which it probably did. It was a race between America and Russia to see who could get to Berlin first once he invaded Russia. Write that down in all your personal notepads. If you ever get the opportunity, do not invade Russia. Come on, people, learn from the mistakes of your ancestors. All right, number 3. This is Pearl Harbor. So, initially the Japanese intended the attack on Pearl Harbor to be a prevention action, hoping to stop the American Pacific Fleet from halting Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia. But for those who aren't, history buffs, instead this drove America to join the Allied parties in the Second World War and ended up with Japanese having 2 atomic bombs dropped on them. So I think people would see that as a blunder. Note to self, do not attack Russia or the United States. All right, number 3. This is a personal favorite. I've mentioned it before, I think twice in this podcast series. This is the takeover and defense and attacks on Munster. I believe it's in Germany, but anyways, the city was taken over by a bunch of radical Protestants called the Anabaptists. I just love that statement so much. And basically what happened is the Anabaptists took over the city from a very powerful bishop. So they kicked the bishop out, They lived in the city for a while until, long story short, they came up with the idea of polygamy, which wasn't too popular amongst the Protestants, and it kind of led to their downfall. But anyways, the the bishop mentioned earlier, he attacked the city several times, but one time his men got so drunk. The idea was that there would be two sides attacking the city of Munster at once to retake it, and one side got so drunk that they saw the setting sun as the rising sun, which was their cue to attack, and so they attacked about 12 hours too early, and this provoked the other side to attack at the same time, and so both sides attack about 12 hours early on accident. And it's said historically that the second side attacked because they thought they wouldn't be able to plunder the city like the other half would if they were late to the party. So they both attack. They both fail in the attack miserably because you're sieging a city at night. The people in the city have torches and all that while you're running through the fields. So the radical Protestants took care of them pretty quickly, but it wasn't until long after that all the radical Protestants were starved out of the city. So all is well that... I shouldn't say that. It's a really great story. Look it up, the story of the Anabaptists in Munster, Germany. There are actually a ton more mistakes in that whole scenario, but that's the only one that really involves the military. But for now, we have to move on to number 2, which is a pretty famous story, which is why I didn't want to put it at number 2. I usually put my famous stories at number 10, just so I can keep you guys learning stuff as we get down into the dirty low numbers of my lists. This is the story of when, in the 1950s, a flock of Canadian geese activated the warning systems for America's nuclear bomb systems. We mistakenly interpreted this as a Soviet bomber attack. The same thing happened about a decade later when we mistaked a meteor shower as a ballistic military attack. And so we don't have a great track record when it comes to determining the difference between birds and missiles in the air. Hopefully we've since rectified that issue. Or thankfully no nuclear bombs were set off as a result, as that would be far more catastrophic. I'm losing my mind. Okay, let's get this over with. Number 1. We don't need any honorable mentions. Number 1, I said the Punic Wars would be coming back, and this is the Battle of Cannae, or Cannae, or however you want to say it. Basically, that Hannibal guy who accidentally caused an avalanche that killed 50,000 of his men, he was being attacked by the Romans, and basically the Hannibal had about half as many men as the Romans did. He had 40,000 while they had around 80 to 90,000. And long story short, Hannibal set up his troops in a horseshoe formation. The Romans set up their troops in a battering ram formation. The battering ram punctured the horseshoe, which ended up turning inside out, and surrounded the Romans. So for about 12 hours, the Romans were surrounded by about half as many troops as they had themselves, but there's not much you can do once you're surrounded. And so Hannibal's losses totaled about 8,000, while the Romans, they were surrounded. They lost all 80,000. So an army half the size of the other only lost about 10% of the bigger army's forces, which is a pretty amazing story. There's a lot more interesting depth to it. If you want to go further into it, look it up or listen to a historical podcast. That would also be fun to do. But that's all I can give you for the time being. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review because it will help me, it'll help us all. Leave a comment below too if there's something you liked, something you didn't like, something you think is funny, a joke you have, let me know. It's fun to be interactive. I'll try to respond to you unless your name is Robby Canton. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that would be spectacular. Thank you and have a god dang good night.